Had an agent ask me the other day, at the end of a commercial tenancy, can the landlord terminate the tenancy because he needs the space himself, or because he has another tenant he wants to put in there, or for no reason at all? And the answer is yes, yes, yes. Unlike the residential tenancies situation, a commercial tenancy, the landlord has the absolute option of terminating the lease at the end of its term. The tenant must vacate. It doesn't automatically go into overholding unless both parties allow it to go into overholding. And if they do, it's still understood that either party, either the landlord or the tenant, can terminate it with 30-day written notice. Very, very different in the Residential Tenancy Act, where at the end of a term, it automatically goes into overholding month by month, and on that situation, the tenant can terminate it at any time, giving notice from the first of a month, a minimum of 60-day notice. The landlord cannot. He cannot terminate it except for cause and its very restrictive circumstances. What about non-payment? Here, as you know, under Residential Tenancies Act, which is very, very onerous consumer protection legislation, the landlord has to file an N4 and then begin working away with through the residential tenancy process to get the tenant evicted. And it's a long process. It can take 6 to 8 months depending on how much the tenant challenges it and so on. Very, very different with a commercial lease and a commercial tenancy. If the tenant fails to pay the rent, even if he's behind by 1 day, the landlord has two options. Option number one, he can notify the tenant that he's seizing the goods and he's going to sell them within 5 days. During that 5-day period, he needs to get two appraisals on the value of the goods that are left in the space, and that tenant has 5 days to bring the lease back into good standing. Failing that, the landlord sells the goods, whatever's left in the space, and any surplus goes back to the tenant. The second option he can do is he can wait 15 days, and at the end of 15 days, he can change the locks, and whatever's inside, he can seize, and it's his to do with as he wishes. What about rent increases? Well, the Commercial Tenancies Act is silent on rent increases. It leaves it to the marketplace. Very unlike the Residential Tenancies Act, where the government sets the maximum increase, and it's very, very conservative, generally less than the cost of living, and the landlord's bound by that. Here in commercial tenancies, the landlord can set it whatever he wants. Now, there may be provisions in the lease. Often in a lease, maybe it's a 5-year lease, there's provision for an option to renew, and it may say that rents are negotiated at the time of the renewal, and there may be a provision to go to arbitration if they can't come up with something reasonable. Or it may say not to exceed 10% or something. But failing some reference in the lease, it's totally up to the landlord and the tenant to negotiate it. And I say the landlord and the tenant. This is something where the landlord can be unreasonable, but the landlord needs to also understand, especially if he has a good tenant and they have a good relationship, he's going to understand that good tenants are hard to find. I've seen situations where the landlord has just cavalierly increased the rent a colossal amount, the tenant has left, the landlord is stuck for months trying to find another good tenant to fill that space. So the dynamics of the marketplace rule, but common sense also rules. And as a commercial landlord, you've got a lot more freedom than you have to terminate. You have a lot more freedom to deal with a lapse in payment of rent. You got a lot more freedom in increasing the rent, but you also got to bear in mind that everybody needs a roof over their head. Everybody doesn't need commercial space, and good tenants are valuable and sometimes hard to find. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I'll talk to you again next week.